The other day we bought a new teapot off of Amazon.com. The brand was some cheap Chinese manufacturer, but you think to yourself, a teapot is a teapot. What does it matter? I put the thing on the stove, getting ready to drink my chamomile tea before Betty Bye time. But this teapot, it gives off a toxic stink. The thing smells like the inside of a garden center. A thing like that happens and you think to yourself, how can you sell this sort of thing? It should be illegal to sell this kind of cheap junk. Anyway, long story short, that's the company that now owns James Bond. The story here is that Amazon MGM Studios has gained creative control of the James Bond franchise. They've entered into what it's my understanding it's a sort of 50-50 partnership between themselves and Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. This partnership, it won't be long before Amazon owns the whole shebang. It may be 50-50 now, but it won't take long. And this is part of this continuing trend of smaller companies, of smaller intellectual properties being consolidated under these big tech conglomerates. This thing with the James Bond franchise, it's very reminiscent of what happened with the Tolkien estate. Lord of the Rings is sort of split between Amazon and the Embracer Group. The Embracer Group is another one of these big sort of conglomerates that sort of just has its tendrils every which way. You've got this sort of nebulously defined Tolkien estate, which, we're told sort of has the best interests of Tolkien's writings at heart. But, you back enough money up to these people's houses and all their lofty ideas about, maintaining the integrity of something. Those sort of go out the window. And it probably won't be long before Lord of the Rings is owned by Amazon or the Embracer Group in its entirety. And the idea of a Tolkien estate, if it isn't already sort of just a name-only sort of method of advertising the property, if the Tolkien estate isn't already essentially ineffective, in the future it will just be a non-entity altogether. You've got the 20th Century Fox Studios, which is now owned by Disney, so that means like Alien, Predator, that's all Disney now. As with a lot of things in modern life, things that were once decentralized to a certain degree are now being consolidated under one big company umbrella. What does that mean for a franchise like James Bond? Well, on the one hand, it might not mean much. While these companies are ostensibly separate, they do kind of, they vibe the same way. So if people are worried about a sudden influx of progressive politics where there wasn't before, I'm not sure it's going to be too different. Didn't they make a Q gay? I didn't ask. Your job is just to sort of make gadgets and add some occasional banter. I didn't ask about your sex life, but didn't they make Q gay in James Bond, and this was pre sort of Amazon having creative ownership of it. They're already putting content warnings at the front of all the James Bond books. Okay, not just content warnings, they're actually being re-edited to remove supposed racist or sexist content. Okay, yeah, good stuff. So I mean, it's sort of hard to gauge, if you were someone who's like, well, they're gonna make it woke now. I don't know. Maybe that ship has already sailed. Even among separate corporate entities, there is still a sort of consolidation of thought and opinion. So I'm not sure you're gonna see much different on that front. Maybe you will. A character like James Bond is just as much held back by his country of origin as he is his corporate ownership. I look at the country of Britain and it doesn't make me think James Bond. I don't think cool MI6 spies when I look at the modern United Kingdom. What's James Bond going to do? Is he going to arrest you for Facebook posts? Is he going to make it so you have to round off all your kitchen knives? So as far as all the back and forth of whether, should James Bond continue to be a white Englishman, or should we have a newer, more diverse, a James Bond that reflects the world that we live in today? As far as that whole thing, I'm not sure it tips the scales one way or another if Amazon has creative control. The one thing that you lose is that friction. It's my understanding there was some friction between Barbara Broccoli and the original rights holders of James Bond and Amazon MGM, and that friction is good. It is necessary. It helps to keep something intact. It helps to keep it in line to some extent with its original intent. And when you don't have that friction anymore, when it is just sort of under the purview of one monolithic entity, naturally something like James Bond is going to default to what's best for the company rather than, what's best for James Bond, what's best for the sort of institution that is James Bond. The problem with increased corporate ownership in general is it does sort of move it away from the original intent or spirit of the thing in question. I mean, you look at James Bond and it was already sort of going that way. We want to tone down the womanizing aspect of James Bond. Whatever James Bond does now, it has to reflect on Amazon, it has to reflect on Jeff Bezos, on Blue Origin, on the Washington Post, on those cheap garbage teapots that spew out toxic fumes. Under Amazon, it might not be a leap to suggest that the way that company sells teapots, it's now the way it's going to sell James Bond. Once upon a time, a James Bond film would be a sort of event. Who's going to be the next James Bond? What's going to be the next James Bond film? There was sort of a rarefied quality about them. They wouldn't pump them out too often, whereas now that Amazon's got its grubby mitts in it, you can expect to see, maybe spin-offs, TV shows. You're going to get a spin-off about the early days of M, the early days of Moneypenny. Was there a Moneypenny show at some point? Anyway, the point is that more is not always better. The ones I'm really looking forward to are the Narnia movies, which are going to be put out by Netflix and directed by Greta Gerwig. I mean, talk about a piece of art that is wildly divergent from the sort of modern progressive corporate ideal. I have no earthly idea how they're going to adapt the final book in the Narnia series, The Last Battle. I have no idea how they're going to even attempt to adapt that one. So there are these instances where the original artistic intent is going to be wildly divergent from what the corporate overlords have in store. One thing to note is, the vibe is shifting. The vibe, there is a vibe shift. Trump won, they've done away with a lot of sort of diversity initiatives. The Super Bowl was playing commercials with wild horses riding across the American desert. So we may see a sort of reaction to the last few years. We may get a James Bond that maintains a bit of an edge, who maintains that sort of devil-may-care attitude of yesteryear. But even still, that's probably less indicative of some genuine change of heart on the behalf of these large corporations and more sort of following where the money is going. And so something like James Bond or Lord of the Rings being increasingly under the purview of a large entity like Amazon, it just sort of makes them another school of fish, or rather, one fish in a larger school of fish. You know what I mean. Where Amazon turns, so will James Bond, so will Lord of the Rings, as opposed to having maybe a bit more independence. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Let me know what you think. Subscribe if so inclined. I write books. If you like books, you can find them on Amazon.com. Isn't that irony of ironies? Anyway, goodbye.